Hi there! Thank you so much for clicking on my channel. I want to start off today's video by saying thank you to everyone who supported me. Whether you're a longtime subscriber of my YouTube channel, or if you follow me on TikTok, or if this is the first time you're ever seeing my face, thank you so much for supporting me. I've received so many words of encouragement over the past few weeks, and I just want to let you guys know that it's incredibly uplifting and it's so rewarding knowing that my hard work is finally paying off, and all of these unsolved cases that I'm hoping to bring awareness to are now being listened to. I never imagined that I would reach the following that I have in this point in time, and when I started off, I told everybody that I'm doing this because I like it and not because I want to be popular or because I want a lot of followers. So the fact that I have stumbled upon as many as I do now, even though I know there are plenty of true crime content creators who have more than me, I just want to let you guys know that I really appreciate you, and I feel extremely honored that you guys look to me for true crime content. So let's go ahead and get into today's video. This case takes us across the border to Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada. Today we're talking about Holly Bartlett, who was a 31-year-old grad student. Holly was described as an extremely intelligent and fun-loving person. Holly was also differently abled. So she was born with Holly did become completely blind in middle school, and I'll let her talk about that in her own words.
When I was born, I had an eye condition called microphthalmia, which in layman's terms means small eyes. When I lost my vision around the age of 13, that was a rather traumatic experience, but everything at 13 is traumatic.
It's really important to know that being blind didn't stop Holly from living her life. It's extremely crucial in this case to understand that Holly was more than her disability. She loved horses, and she had actually won several medals in horseback riding competitions. She was also really interested in swing dancing, and she'd even been skydiving before. She was a fiercely independent person, and a testament to this would be how when her sister first found out that she went skydiving, it was when she was in when Holly was in her car, and she was like, "Yeah, Holly, what have you been up to?" And she was like, "Oh yeah, last weekend I went skydiving." Like, Holly didn't need a caretaker or someone to follow her around constantly. She actually lived by herself in a condo that was like on a really high floor. Like, she was completely independent. She didn't need anyone to cook for her. She didn't need anyone to help her clean the house or get her to and from school. She was able to operate completely on her own. So this brings us to Holly's last day on Earth, and this was Friday, March 26th, 2010. The grad school was throwing a kind of celebration for all of the grad students. So she first went out to a house party that was kind of doubling as a pregame, and to be polite, she arrived with a bottle of wine, which everyone paid her back for using cash, and then they drank a little bit and came. The grad school was having a celebration for their students, but first there was a pregame at one of their houses. So Holly brought a bottle of wine to be polite, and everyone paid her back for this in cash. And they drank the bottle of wine, and then they walked to the venue where the party was at. At this event, she had a few mixed drinks and a few glasses of wine. She had an estimated amount of 6 drinks over the course of 6 hours, and she did eat during this. Holly was a thin girl, and she was less than 5 feet tall. I believe she was 4'11" to be exact. But Holly could handle her alcohol. One of her friends even jokingly called her Bottles Bartlett because she could drink and hold her liquor so well. In fact, during this party, someone got a martini and they didn't like it. I'm guessing that it was too strong for them. And Holly, not wanting the drink to go to waste, was like, "Oh yeah, I'll drink it, it's fine." So later on in the night, Holly says that she wants to leave and she calls a cab, but she does decide that she wants to stay a little bit longer. So I think this cab was later canceled, but shortly after this, Holly said her goodbyes and then did decide that it was time for her to leave. So she calls a cab, and her friend does walk her out to the cab because this is a situation where a blind person would need assistance, because there's all these cars in the parking lot. How is she going to know which one is her taxi? So she does need somebody at that point, and her friend walks her out to the cab, and she said that she knows that Holly is drunk. Like, they've all been drinking. It's one of those like free alcohol open bar events. So she knows Holly's drunk, but she puts her into the cab along with Holly's purse and cane, and she doesn't feel like Holly needs escorting home at all. Sadly, the next time any of Holly's loved ones ever see her is when she's unresponsive in a hospital bed. Holly had been found the following morning laying on the ground underneath a bridge in the freezing cold. She had been laying there all night, and it wasn't until 6 a.m. the next morning that construction workers came to work and saw her body. When the ambulance came to pick her up, her body temperature was 23 degrees, and she had a blood alcohol content of 0.09. Again, 0.09, it's above the legal driving limit for sure, and you are going to be drunk at that point, but it's not like she's hammered. Like some of these other cases I've looked at, their alcohol is like 0.2, and that's like you're extremely drunk. So the EMTs who examined Holly noticed that she had severe bruises on her face, cuts to her hands and knees, but it's like the back of her hands, not her palms. And then her leg is broken and some of her ribs are broken. And they also noticed that she has a lot of bruising on her butt. Kind of like, you fall down. Maybe this has happened to you. You fall down, you have like a huge bruise on your butt because that's where you landed. Holly also had a large bruise around her mouth, and the medical examiner said this resembled somebody who'd gotten punched in the face. Holly does eventually succumb to her injuries, and her cause of death is ruled to be blunt force trauma to the head and severe hypothermia. They also do perform an SA kit, so they check, and she hasn't been SA'd at all. Her purse was found near her body along with a Harley Davidson hat, but this Harley Davidson hat was never looked at. They just assumed that it was litter. And there was no DNA testing done on it or anything. But her purse was found near her body, and inside was an expired school ID, a bus pass, a Tim Hortons card, which is like a Publix or Kroger card. They also found inside of her purse gloves, sunglasses, and then her ID for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. And at first they think that maybe Holly jumped off the bridge or fell off the bridge, but there were security cameras showing the traffic on the McKay Bridge, and there were no pedestrians on the side at the time that Holly must have fallen over. So the next morning, which is Saturday morning, a security guard finds the rest of Holly's belongings in the parking lot outside of her apartment complex. So he finds her iPhone, lip gloss, and some loose change. And he said that the way he found all of these things was kind of like they were strewn in a line on the concrete, almost like they'd been thrown from a moving vehicle. So Holly was found on the ground at the base of a giant concrete abutment. And if you don't know what an abutment is, basically imagine like a huge slab of concrete that is used to support the base of a bridge, because remember, she was found underneath the bridge. This was an extremely tall and wide abutment, and it was actually 32 feet high and as wide as a tennis court. The outside of the abutment and kind of surrounding the base of this bridge was a padlocked chain link fence. So the police say that Holly had an accident that night after the taxi dropped her off at home. But in order to properly tell this story, I need to pull up a map of the area surrounding her home. Okay, so this is the way that she walked. So her apartment complex was facing kind of like a cul-de-sac, like a round area, and they were saying that the cab driver pulled up around this area and she got out, but instead of walking towards her apartment complex, she instead walked away from it because she didn't know which direction she was walking. They say that she walked down North Ridge Road, which leads to that bridge, and this bridge does have heavy car traffic over it. She walked down the street thinking that she was walking towards her apartment building, and then she found herself at the base of the bridge. Not where the cars are, but more off to the side, further down towards the actual base of the bridge, where it hits the earth. This is where she falls. And then there was a small hole in the chain link fence where she fell. And the scent dog that they were using to track Holly's movements from like the front of her apartment complex down to where she was found. And the scent dog went right through this hole in the chain link fence. And it was a pretty small hole, so most humans wouldn't be able to fit through it. But Holly, being 4'11" and a slender build, she was able to crawl through it. She then crawled on her hands and knees to the top of the concrete slope, aka the abutment, where she then crawled over the edge when she got to the top, not knowing that that was the end. I felt like this was confusing, so I went on Google Street View and started going down North Ridge Road, which is the route that Holly supposedly took. And she basically walked down this road, and then she eventually branched off, going down a grassy decline. And that's where she fell and went through a hole in the chain link fence, and that put her underneath the bridge where the abutment was that she would eventually climb up and then fall off. It's giving Velma without her glasses. Did you guys ever watch Scooby-Doo, and like almost every episode Velma's glasses would come off and she would be like crawling around on her hands and knees trying to find her glasses, and she would get into like the most ridiculous situations. She would be at like the top of a roller coaster, or like about to crawl like into a pit filled with alligators. Like she would get herself into the craziest situations, and that is what I feel like the police logic is in this case. So there was no concrete dust or concrete residue found on her knees or her shoes. So that really doesn't match up with the story, because if you're crawling along this large slope of concrete, there's gonna be like microscopic tiny pieces of concrete on you, but this was not found on Holly. Less than 72 hours after her death, and before the autopsy is even finished, the police rule this an accidental death due to confusion and disorientation while being intoxicated. Her family find this so hard to believe because Holly got around just fine on her own, whether she was sober or drunk. So, of course, the family is devastated by this, but Holly's mom in particular has complete faith that the police are going to be able to figure out what happened to her daughter. And that's honestly like so sad, because they just completely dropped the ball in Holly's case. One of the first things that her mom asks about was, okay, did you find her cane? Because how did she get into this situation? She always carries her cane around. She would know that a chain link fence was there if she's waving her cane in front of her. And the police say that they didn't find Holly's walking cane. But 2 days later, her friends, Holly's friends, arrive back to the scene of Holly's death, and they find Holly's cane leaning up against the outside of the chain link fence that was surrounding the area. This cane was in basically plain sight, and it's really hard to believe that it had been sitting there for as long as it did, because police were completely surrounding the area, as well as scent dogs that were looking for Holly's smell. So how did nobody notice that her cane was sitting upright against the fence? And it also had like a fluorescent reflective outside so that you could see it with a flashlight. And it was leaning up against the fence almost as if somebody placed it there. And presumably this would have been Holly, but why would a blind person leave their cane in that situation? That's like your lifeline, basically. It's how you know if there's anything dangerous around you. And if she had had her cane on the other side of the fence, then this would have never happened. Unfortunately, there's no way to know if someone placed Holly's cane there because no fingerprint testing was ever done. Her family can just tell that the officers don't see Holly as a person. Instead, they're seeing her as a disabled person. The discrimination that disabled people face can be really harmful, especially in cases like this, because Holly's situation never received a full investigation. The responding officer even had in his notes that he needed to find her full-time caretaker. And again, Holly would have been so offended by this. One of her friends who used to be her roommate even told a story about how one night Holly went out with her friends and she didn't come back the next morning. So he called her at like 7 a.m. being like, "Oh my God, where are you? I'm worried." And she got really mad at him actually. She was like, "I can handle myself. You don't need to check up on me." And he was like, "I mean, I would have checked up on you regardless. Like, I wasn't trying to say that it was like because you're blind." If Holly could horseback ride, get to and from university every day, and skydive, it's really hard to believe that she couldn't get from a cab into her apartment. So this is one of those cases where like the family and friends do the investigation because the police won't take it seriously. So in order to fully understand what happened that night, they need to talk to the last person who ever saw Holly. And this was the cab driver who was named Paul Frazier. He had been driving for a casino cab for many years and he had never received any complaints about his driving or his behavior. So the police sit down with Paul and they interview him about what Holly was like that night. And he said that she was like 8 out of 10 drunk, one of the drunkest. He doesn't really elaborate on this, but he said that when she got into the car, he could tell that she was wasted and they didn't talk during the drive. And the whole time she was just like rummaging through her purse for something. When police mention that Holly is blind, Paul goes, "Oh no." And they're like, "Oh my God, what does that mean?" So Paul says that the drop-off went completely normal, but when she got out of the car and he pulled up alongside the side of the road, when Holly got out of the car, she got out of the driver's side as opposed to the passenger's side. The driver's side was actually facing away from her apartment. So that means that she wasn't facing her like path, she was actually facing the wrong direction. So this is his first story. He says that the ride went completely normal. He dropped her off. She got out on the wrong side and then he drove off. So to verify this, Holly's friends actually realize that Holly's apartment is the very first stop for a city bus. That means that the bus is going to sit there for longer than usual. It's kind of like where the bus driver takes their break. And so the city bus must have been sitting there while this was happening. And so they contact the bus company, they watch the security cameras, and you can see the cab that Holly is in drive in front of the bus and go in the direction of her apartment, and then it leaves. Then the bus starts its route and it goes to turn onto Navalia Drive to go back downtown. And on the security camera, you can see that the cab is sitting at a nearby side street called Kincrest Avenue, kind of like waiting for the bus to pass. And this suggests that the cab is actually going to turn back towards Holly's building, which is weird because it had already dropped her off. So why would the cab driver go back? They mention this to the cab driver and he says, yes, I actually went back to the location where I dropped this woman off because I felt bad because I saw her trip and fall on a curb when I was driving away, but I didn't stop to help her. So this cab driver, Paul Frazier, has conflicting stories. Paul does say that he came back to check on Holly a second time, but she wasn't there anymore. But at another point, he says that he felt guilty because he actually tricked Holly that night. Paul Frazier admits that Holly had given him 3 20s and 3 5s for cab fare that night when the ride was actually nowhere near that. And then for change, he gave her only $1.50, basically taking all of this money when he really only needed a fraction of it to cover the cost of the ride. Again, this does not make sense if he didn't know that Holly was blind. Maybe he just thought that he was tricking a drunk girl who didn't count the money, or maybe he knew that he was tricking a blind person. Either way, this guy sounds like a piece of shit. Maybe he had plans to rob Holly that night and she fought back, and so he hurt her and that's how she ended up there. So let's get into some theories regarding what happened to Holly that night. The first theory, of course, is the main police theory, and it's that she was disoriented and thought that she was walking towards her apartment when in reality she was walking away from it. But mostly everyone who knows Holly and knows anyone who's blind, and honestly anyone with common sense, has ruled out this theory because it just doesn't make any sense that you would be that confused. Because I feel like you could even blindfold her seeing neighbors and be like, okay, walk towards the apartment or walk towards the bridge, and they would know which direction they're going because the roar of traffic was so loud. Another thing is that when blind people are taught to walk around in public, they're taught how to orient themselves, and Holly's teacher said that she was actually one of the best students he's ever had at this. So instead of being confused and just walking and not knowing where you're going, blind people are taught to stand there, pause, listen, figure out like which way traffic's going, figure out which direction they are, and then to move. You wouldn't be like running around confused the way it seems that Holly might have been. So that was the police theory. And then there's another really sad theory, and that's that Holly purposefully did this. So something that the police asked her family about was, what if she jumped off the bridge purposefully to end her own life? And sadly, Holly did suffer from depression, and she was on medication for this, and the depression was related to her father's serious illness. So her father had a really serious chronic illness. I'm not sure which one it was, but it was very clear to the family that he didn't have very much time left. And there's a theory that Holly did this to herself on purpose because she couldn't bear to see her dad's passing. But I do find it really difficult to believe that she would do this to herself and miss out on time with her father, as opposed to doing it like after he passed away, if that makes sense. It's also really disputed that she would jump from the bridge because there were security cameras on this bridge. Also, the drivers who were driving across the bridge that night that were questioned by the police said that there were no pedestrians on it. So if Holly had been standing on the side of the bridge, whether she was standing there alone or with somebody else, you'd think that one of the drivers would have seen her and spoken to the police about this. So there's also, of course, the theory that the cab driver had something to do with this. I think that Paul Fraser is acting extremely suspicious. So given the theory that Paul Fraser did something to Holly, it's possible that he came back a second time because he noticed that she had left stuff in his car, which, was her phone, the lip gloss, and then I think some of the cash that the security guard found. So maybe when he drove around that second time, he threw it out the window and then drove off. And then another thing that makes sense, given that Paul is a bad guy in this case, is that Holly put her cane on the floorboard of the car, and then when she got out, however she got out, it was left there, and he didn't notice it right away. And then 2 days later, when he realized that this woman's cane was still in his car, he got out and then left it where he saw the crime scene. Paul Fraser is an extremely sketchy person to me. He's done numerous interviews, and you can find these on YouTube if you want to watch. And I just don't really understand why he would say that it was a normal drop-off and then backtrack and be like, oh, well, I did come back a second time, but she wasn't there. If he was talking to the police and he was supposed to be giving them details about the last moments of a woman's life, it doesn't make sense that he would leave something out if he wasn't hiding something. Something that people have theorized in this case is that instead of taking Holly to the cul-de-sac that I mentioned earlier that was in front of her apartment complex, that he took her to another nearby area to rob her. And that's when she ran out of his car and was disoriented and didn't know where to go, and that's how she ended up at the base of the bridge. But again, that's really odd. And then the final theory in this case is actually a really interesting one, and it has to do with the phrase cold crazy. So Holly did die of hypothermia because it was extremely cold that night. When you're experiencing hypothermia, you can kind of sometimes experience something called cold crazy. And that is when you have induced delusions caused by the hypothermia. So maybe the fact that she was drunk, I think being drunk also will speed up the hypothermia. So maybe she was outside, and whether this was because she was running away from Paul Frazier or whether it's because like he just dropped her off, it's possible that like being hypothermic could have caused her to have such severe delusions that she went in a direction opposite of her apartment. The most common version of cold crazy that you'll hear is when someone starts getting really hot even though they're actually dying of the cold, and they'll take off their clothes. And you'll see this a lot in true crime when somebody's found naked in the snow. So sadly, Holly's case is still officially ruled an accident in the eyes of the Canadian police. If I were her family, I would totally look into filing a lawsuit against them for negligence, because I do not feel like they fully investigated this for foul play. They just kind of saw Holly as like a drunk blind girl who didn't know where she was going. There are so many questions that I don't feel like were fully asked or answered by the police, and sadly so much time has passed that I don't know if we'll ever get answers, because it's been 12 years since Holly has passed away, and sadly this case might forever remain a mystery. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. And as always, I would love to hear your thoughts on this case. Like, what do you think happened to Holly? Do you think that Paul, the cab driver, was involved? Or do you think that maybe she was disoriented? I would love to hear what you guys think actually happened to Holly. Until next video, I hope you guys all have a wonderful rest of your day and stay safe.